Welcome to Hub History, where we go far beyond the Freedom Trail to share our favorite stories from the history of Boston, the hub of the universe. This is episode 237, Revolutionary Surgeons, with Dr. Per-Olof Hasselgren. Hi, I'm Jake. In just a few moments, I'm going to be joined by Dr. Per-Olof Hasselgren, a practicing surgeon and author of the recent book, Revolutionary Surgeons, Patriots and Loyalists on the Cutting Edge. The book's a profile of 11 surgeons on both sides of the Revolutionary War. Dr. Hasselgren and I discussed the Boston Patriots, brothers, and brothers-in-arms, Joseph and John Warren. Joseph is famous for arranging the lantern signal from Old North Church and dispatching Paul Revere on his famous ride, as well as for his heroic death at Bunker Hill. His little brother John followed him into politics and into the Continental Army, before founding Harvard Medical School in the waning years of the Revolution. Per-Olof brings a unique perspective to our conversation, examining the medical careers of these eminent physicians through a physician's eyes. We'll talk about how 18th century physicians learned their craft, how they earned a living, and how they intermingled medicine and politics. We also discuss how surgery was changing during the Revolutionary era, and the groundbreaking surgery pioneered by John Warren and by his son John Collins Warren. But before we talk about the Warren brothers and medicine during the Revolution, it's time for a word from the sponsor of this week's podcast. Liberty & Co. sells unique products inspired by the American Revolution, and many of them have themes tied to the historical events, locations, and people of Boston's past. One of their specialties is a range of beautiful prints, many of which are made using historical methods right here in Boston by the historical print shop Eads & Gill that operates out of Faneuil Hall. Printer Gary Gregory adopted the name of the 18th century print shop that published the Boston Gazette, a notorious Whig paper that printed Joseph Warren's essay A True Patriot that helped fan the flames of revolution and nearly got Warren locked up. Gary uses a reproduction of a wooden English common press that was made in colonial Williamsburg to print faithful reproductions of historic documents using authentic materials, equipment, and methods. Among the prints available from Liberty & Co. is a reproduction of Thomas Paine's American Crisis, the legendary pamphlet that helped George Washington inspire his soldiers to stick out the cold winter at Valley Forge with the opening challenge, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he who stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph." You could also select a magnificent copy of the Declaration of Independence, carefully reproduced from the Dunlap broadside, which was the very first printed version of the Declaration, with the first pressing struck in Philadelphia on the evening of July 4th, 1776. The Eads & Gill copy is printed at 3/4 scale, to be more convenient to frame and display in your home than a full 18th century broadsheet. Liberty & Co. also offers beautiful reproductions of Paul Revere's engraving of the British troops landing at Long Wharf to begin the occupation of Boston, and a carefully rendered 1775 British military map of Boston created during the siege. You can get 20% off of any order and help support the show when you shop at libertyand.co and use discount code HUBHISTORY at checkout. That's libertyand.co and use the discount code HUBHISTORY. I'm joined now by Dr. Per-Olof Hasselgren, author of the new book Revolutionary Surgeons, Patriots and Loyalists on the Cutting Edge. He's a practicing surgeon at Beth Israel, and he has an endowed chair at Harvard Medical School. He also has a long-standing interest in surgical and American history. As you hear his charming accent, you may be tempted to think that Dr. Hasselgren is an unlikely scholar of the American Revolution, but his extensive knowledge of 18th century surgical history argues otherwise. Per-Olof, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So I've invited you here today to discuss your book, Revolutionary Surgeons, Patriots and Loyalists on the Cutting Edge, which is basically composed of profiles of 10 surgeons who were active in the American Revolution. What were your goals? What were you hoping to achieve with this book?
Well, maybe first to satisfy my own curiosity, when I sort of discovered how important surgeons had been during the American Revolution, I got even more interested. I come from another country. I come from Sweden originally, and we don't learn much about American history. Mm-hmm. In Sweden, like you guys may not learn that much about European history as we do, obviously.
Right.
And then I am a surgeon since 45 years and have been interested in surgical history for many years. And then when I came to this country, I also became interested in the American history. And when I understood they merged, so to speak, I got even more that piqued my interest. And that sort of generated my reading a lot about this. And I realized that not much was written about surgeons during the American Revolution. I mean, there are a lot of books about surgeons in the Civil War, in the World Wars, etc., but relatively little information, fewer books about surgeons in the American Revolution. And so here we are.
What's your surgical specialty?
So it's what we call endocrine surgery, which means surgery of thyroid gland, parathyroid gland, adrenal gland, etc.
So how do you go from endocrine surgery to such an intense interest in the history of surgery and surgeons?
Well, that's not a natural leap from endocrine surgery specifically, but more from surgery as such. And that sort of generated my combined interest in the American Revolution and the history of surgery. Because there was not a lot of endocrine surgery specifically at the time of the American Revolution. That had not been sort of practiced yet.
It sounds like there weren't really surgical subspecialties at all during that era.
That's right. There was not even a subspecialty in terms of surgeon versus doctors in a sense, not a formal division of that. But so a surgeon was a physician who was interested in doing surgery, basically, and it was more common to have a mixed type of practice in those days. But some people got more into anatomy and dissection and surgery and got to do that most of the time. But I think there were only few surgeons who did only surgery in their practices, and obviously no surgeons did endocrine surgery at that time.
How many of the physicians in the book would have even had formal medical education?
So the formal medical education was done by doing apprenticeships, and all of them that I describe in the book had formal training in that sense. A few lucky ones had sort of wealthy parents or other means to get to Europe for further training, and then they could end up in Edinburgh finally. Usually they went to London first for a couple of years and did sort of practical cutting and surgery. But there were no medical schools in London at that time, and the academic education of physicians and surgeons took place basically in Edinburgh. And among these surgeons that I've described, probably 4 or 5 of them had MD degrees when they came back from England.
The Revolutionary era was basically 70 years before anesthesia was first used here in Boston, and closer to a century before antibiotics became widespread. So what would surgery have looked like during the Revolutionary era?
Well, because of lack of anesthesia, obviously surgery needed to be fast. A common saying is that it was fast, dirty, and dangerous. And so the fast part of that statement reflects the fact that patients obviously suffered horrendous pain. And so most likely outside any quote-unquote operating room, there would be screams and hollers and kicking and so forth that would be perceived not only by people in the surrounding, but by the patient, obviously, and also by the surgeons. So that was probably one aspect of it. And the other aspect of the pain, obviously, was that patients did not allow themselves to be cut into unless they really had a dangerous or a painful condition, such as a bladder stone, for example, or gangrene of the leg that they understood they would die if they didn't take the leg off. So the other aspect of your question, I guess, is related to antibiotics. And so antibiotics, as you pointed out, came around much later on when the concept of bacteria had been sort of discovered and listed and propagated for sterile conditions during operations. So in those days, in the 1700s, I think they were lucky if they had clean or sanitized conditions. And one of these surgeons I describe in the book, Benjamin Rush from Philadelphia, he worked hard on getting cleanliness into the concept of surgical care and medical care, although he didn't also understand, obviously, that there were bacteria around. But he, just by intuition, he understood that if you had dirty fingers, that shouldn't be good. And so that's a great difference from nowadays, obviously.
Was surgery changing during the Revolutionary War? And there would have been an abundance of patients that seems like it may have accelerated change.
Yeah, so surgery was developing and evolving during that time. And so the 18th century, the 1700s, has been characterized as the era or century of surgeon anatomists. So the foundation, obviously, of surgery was understanding the anatomy, and that became widespread during the 1700s, and hence the surgeons in those days understood better and better what the body looked like. There had been religious and other reasons people hadn't done dissections that much before, although it's in itself, having said that, it's also an ancient thing, but it sort of took off during the 1700s, in particular in Europe. Physicians interested in surgery started to understand what the body looked like, and that in itself promoted development of the surgical techniques and surgical procedures that could be performed a little more safely than previously.
You're careful to point out in the book that although it's about 10 of our Revolutionary War era physicians, you're careful to point out that not every physician or not every American surgeon was a patriot. But the first couple of chapters are about some of our favorite local patriots. If you don't mind, I'd like to ask you a little bit about the Warren family, starting with Joseph Warren, who kicks off the book. I like to think of Joseph Warren almost as the ultimate patriot. He was the mastermind of Paul Revere's Ride, the hero of Bunker Hill. You start his chapter with a description of his death at Bunker Hill. I know at one point when he was alive, General Warren said that he hoped to die knee-deep in British blood. How close to the truth did he come?
Yeah, so he understood that blood would be shed during a revolution or during a breaking away from the English Empire. And he, as you pointed out, I think I quoted that even, that we will probably walk knee-high in the blood if this happens. And, when he was at Bunker Hill or Breed's Hill, they had this redoubt up on the top, and when the redcoats finally broke through the defense lines, which took them 3 marches up the hill, as you obviously know. But when they finally broke through, I mean, they were brutal. I mean, they killed everything in their way, and there were blood flowing in those redoubts. And so he got his wish fulfilled, one can say, literally.
And he was a very recognizable figure, an orator, a politician. So he would have been recognized by the redcoats as they came up into the redoubt. Yes,
so they recognized him. Also, they were delightful to see him there, to be able to kill him. I mean, he was hated. There are descriptions when he walked around the streets of Boston before the war started, and the redcoats arrested him, and they didn't let him alone because they understood he already was and would become an important leader of any movement that would develop to break away from the motherland, so to speak. And so the saying was that the death of him was worth 500 lives for the British, and that may have been true. And so he was well recognized and was probably a target. So I guess when he showed up there at one of those defense lines, I'm not sure if they knew he was up there when they started the battle, but when they discovered that, and I think they knew who they were killing, and they treated his body badly after his death.
Do you want to describe what was done to him?
If you read different historians' descriptions of it and other original sources, I think it's not completely known, but I think it's fair to say that he obviously was killed by being shot at close range, and then they stuffed the scoundrel into one hole together with another dead revolutionary warrior. Mm-hmm. And then they came back later on, I think the same day even, and took the dirt away from his body, stamped on it. I mean, they were stamping on his body and mutilated the body and chopped his head off. and then they threw him back into that hole in the ground. And it would actually take 1 year before the body was discovered or was found. And that's in itself is an interesting story. So when he had died at the Battle of Bunker Hill, his younger brother John came down from Salem, where he was starting a surgical practice at that time, and was looking for his brother. And obviously John got scared when he couldn't find him, and he finally realized that he was probably killed. Joseph was probably killed, and to the great sorrow of him and his family. And then later on, about a year later, I think, there was a search patrol going out trying to identify the grave where Joseph Warren had been buried. And they found this body and the remnants of the body and the head, more importantly perhaps. And this is sometimes quoted as the first forensic work in terms of looking at a dead body and trying to determine the cause of death and so forth. I mean, like an autopsy after a murder, for example. And so Revere was in the group of people looking for the grave. And Revere said, aha, I can see that is Joseph's head, because he has this prosthesis that I made for him. So he was also, as you know, Paul Revere was a silversmith. Mm-hmm. So he had made a prosthesis in Joseph's upper jaw. And that when he found that, he said, I recognize this is Joseph's head, or Joseph's skull.
The brutality that the British treated him with kind of goes to show how hated he was for being such a leader. But when you look back on his early life, he seems like both an unlikely leader and really an unlikely surgeon. How did Joseph Warren go from a boyhood on a farm in rural Roxbury to Harvard and then on to be a doctor?
Well, obviously, the way you just described, that is going through school. I mean, he went to Roxbury Latin School, I think it was called, and then he went to Harvard at the age of 14. Which seemed to have been a common age at that time when you started college. And he became interested in anatomy relatively early. And that's what sort of spiked his interest in becoming a physician and ultimately a surgeon. And then after college, his further education or his further life, so to speak, was also interesting, because then he was supported by the local people living in Roxbury at that time. His father had died, and his mother was taking care of him and his brothers and was trying to run the farm. So they were not wealthy people. So the local people in Roxbury, I think, supported him economically to go to college, and he paid that back after the Harvard years by being a school teacher in Roxbury for about a year. And then he pursued the medical interest by applying for and being accepted for apprenticeship with James Lloyd, who was one of the premier surgeons and physicians in Boston at that time. He was sort of a higher society type of physician. But he took on Joseph Warren, and he had an apprenticeship of 2 years. And then he got his, that's sort of goes back to the first question you asked, how many were formally trained and had an education. So the formal training, as I said, for Joseph Warren and later on for John as well, was an apprenticeship. And the typical thing was that they were like maybe 3 to 5 years. His first apprenticeship was 2 years. And maybe because he was smart and a good student, or maybe because of economic restraints. But then at the end of an apprenticeship, the master would issue a diploma confirming that this and that person has gone through the training and is now considered able to independently practice medicine.
Only about a year, not much more than a year after Dr. Warren started his own practice, there was a smallpox epidemic in Boston in 1764. And I've talked about this epidemic pretty extensively in the past on the podcast, but always from a patient's perspective, usually using the lens of John Adams, because he wrote so much about his experience. But what would a smallpox epidemic like that have been like from the perspective of a physician like Joseph Warren?
So Joseph Warren, as you pointed out, 1764, just shortly after his finishing his apprenticeship, was starting and opening up his own practice. And then Boston was hit by another round of smallpox epidemics. The best known smallpox epidemic in Boston was the one 1721, because that's when inoculation really started to take off. Mm-hmm. You had Dr. Boylston, and then, what's his name?
Cotton Mather.
Cotton Mather, right.
Onismus.
Exactly right. So that story you obviously are familiar with. Yeah. And they suffered, a lot of harassment from the public and from clergy, etc., etc. So that influenced them. I think that aspect had sort of vanished at the time of Joseph Warren's help with inoculations. So at the time, the governor in Massachusetts ordered assembled a group of physicians, among them Joseph Warren, to inoculate Bostonians for free. And obviously it was a dangerous proposition, because they dealt with live virus, although they didn't know about virus at that time, but they dealt with material or matter that they understood could give themselves smallpox. So they sort of became heroes, and I think Joseph's participation in the smallpox, in the inoculation campaign 1764, helped him to become one of the heroes in Boston, and sort of got him onto a running start in terms of then building on that reputation and generating patients for his practice.
It's about a decade, a little more than a decade between that smallpox outbreak and his death. What would he have been doing in the meantime to grow his practice?
So I know there were advertisements in those days, newspapers. I haven't seen any ad from him, but for example, Dr. Benjamin Church advertised about his skills and that he was coming back from England. And that was one of the advantages, having the foreign training, that you came back with an MD degree and could really brag and boast about that. And Joseph Warren, I'm not certain he advertised in the same way. But I think, like for any good surgeon, or like for anybody who wants to build a surgical practice or a medical practice, one, you need to be a good doctor, and you need to be a compassionate doctor, and you need to treat your patients well. And I think he did that. And he treated patients regardless of their status in the society, which I think obviously was appreciated. And he also, obviously he needed income, so he charged patients. It was a practice for fee type of practice.
Of course, Blue Cross and Medicare wouldn't have existed yet.
Right. But the impression you get when you read documents about him or other biographies about him is that he was not primarily interested in the money. He was a humanistic person, I think, and who really wanted to help people. And that obviously helped in terms of building a practice. And he had patients from all different layers of society, both from the Loyalist side, so to speak, and from the higher society and from Whigs. And I don't think he really, at least initially, didn't care about that. He didn't pay attention to that. Later on, when he became an active patriot, probably that would play a greater role in his, not in the way he treated patients, but probably in terms of which patients came to see him, I would assume.
And ironically, it sounded like his care for some of the poorest people in Boston helped generate the most reliable revenue for his practice.
So there was this almshouse. There was type of a socialized medicine in a way. And I think I even make that parallel in the book, if I remember correctly. But so there was patients who were and the care for those patients were paid for by the state, by Massachusetts state. And it was also like today we have a similar situation with the VA. A physician working at the VA, he gets a salary, mm-hmm. and a fixed salary, and there are no fees to be paid for by the patients. And the same thing at the almshouse. And it also became a source of controversy, I think, because they were expecting, the surgeons who did that were expecting a good compensation from the state. And they were accused of being too interested in that. Maybe not Joseph Warren that much as his brother later on. Was criticized for that to try to suck as much out of that system as possible in terms of economic remuneration.
And during this period when he was building his practice and finding a way to make a living from it, what was Joseph Warren's family life like?
So he married a at least comparatively wealthy woman, Elizabeth Houghton, and interesting enough, that was described in the local press at that time that this young, successful doctor is marrying Elizabeth Houghton, a lady of good resources or something like that was the expression. And I think there were some rumors that he actually married her for the money, which I mean, from when I read, I don't think that was the case. I think they had a good marriage and they had 4 children. And she died at a relatively young age, tragically. And so all of a sudden he was a widower with 4 children to take care of. So, and he was, I think he was a good catch, or looked upon as a good catch for women. So I don't think he would have had a difficulty finding another wife later on, although he never had time to really establish that completely. So he found there was one lady who he probably most likely was engaged with, and they planned to marry later on. All that is also somewhat uncertain from historical documents. But he also probably had some affairs on the side. There is the story about the young woman who got pregnant already when she was a teenager. And what has raised historians' suspicions is that on the day, I think it was the same day as the Battle of Bunker Hill occurred, he was a little delayed coming there because he had seen a pregnant patient, as was explained in some documents. And I think the suspicion is, or the assumption may have been that he was to see her and make certain that her pregnancy was doing well before he went to the battlefield. And he said he will be back later on. I'll just need to take care of these redcoats first. But obviously he didn't make it back. So he had, and he may have had other women in his life as well. So there is this story about Mrs. Gage. Marianne, I think, first name.
Who is the wife of General Thomas Gage.
Exactly right, who was the commander in Boston at that time. And so the rumor about, he called the alarm because he was alerted to the fact that the British was coming out of Boston and going to Lexington and Concord. And so the question was, how on earth did he know about that? So there is these historical rumors, so to speak, that somebody whispered in his ear, and that may have been Margaret Gage, although that is also somewhat uncertain. There are other historians who claim that Margaret Gage may have been the mistress of Paul Revere rather than Joseph Warren. So people conducted those type of affairs in those days as well. As
the imperial crisis starts heating up, Joseph Warren takes on more and more of a high-profile political role in Whig politics. But I'm also curious how he experienced some of the big events during that era as a physician. So what was Dr. Warren's role in the murder of Christopher Snyder and in the Boston Massacre? So
when Christopher Snyder was killed, Joseph Warren was the one who got charged to the autopsy of him, and he could release a pretty clear report, confirmed that he died from the shot from the. I think he was a customs officer, but
yeah, a customs officer. His name off the top of my head either.
No, right. But so there's so many names in this. But anyhow, no. So that was his task at that time. When he came to the Boston Massacre, he was involved in that as well. He was part of a delegation that went to Hutchinson and said, "You better get the British troops out of Boston because this is getting bad now. I mean, we can't live with this." And so he was part of that. So, but there was another one of the revolutionary surgeons who then got charged with doing the autopsy of Attucks, who was killed early on during the massacre, and that was Benjamin Church who did that autopsy.
Who has his own chapter in your book.
Exactly right.
Hutchinson had been a patient of Warren's, right? But it sounds like politics got in the way of their personal relationship.
I think it ultimately did, but I think they were good friends and, as you said, had a good patient-doctor relationship initially. And as I also indicated before, I mean, when things started to crystallize in terms of where the continent was going, with the division between the British and the Americans, it probably became more and more difficult to keep up a good relationship between them. And I think the patient-doctor relationship that at least I describe in the book about his headaches and stuff like that was earlier on, before the friction really had started to degenerate the relationship between them.
As Joseph Warren became more politically involved, or at least more visible politically, what sort of role was he playing? What was his role within Whig politics?
So he was a member of the Sons of Liberty, obviously, and he was mentored, I think, by Samuel Adams, and became involved in that way. He became involved in the Massachusetts Congress. He became involved in terms of being a driving force behind the Committee of Communications, and then, of course, the Suffolk points that were made and brought to the Congress later on about the liberty of people, etc., etc. So he was very active and he was very prominent. But all the time he did keep his surgical business or surgical practice going. Actually, he was in his surgical office on the night before the Lexington Concord events.
Aside from Bunker Hill, that's probably the thing that people most know Joseph Warren for, is for orchestrating the 2 by sea lantern signals at Old North Church and then the midnight ride of Paul Revere and William Dawes. But how did Warren personally react to the intelligence that the British were going to march on Lexington and Concord?
You know, when he realized that the skirmish had actually started, that there was actually activities going on, or an engagement going on, he closed his practice. He turned his patients over to Eustace, the future Massachusetts governor, and told Eustace, "You take care of the patients. I have to ride out there and help out on the battlefield." So he was both at Lexington, but he probably arrived more in time for the engagement in Concord, and so he was portrayed by his military colleagues to be very brave, indeed even reckless, and he was involved both as a military, trying to kill redcoats, but also trying to treat injured soldiers on the field. So he was very active indeed.
Yeah, that's an aspect that I've not read nearly as much about. You always hear about the signal and the dispatching of the signal riders, and you hear less about his personal involvement in the battle. How did he spend? There were roughly 2 months then. The Lexington and Concord fight happens at the sort of mid-April, and then Bunker Hill's in mid-June, June 17th, I guess. So how did Dr. Warren spend the couple of months intervening?
So I think he continued to have a very important political role. Because now was when the siege of Boston started, really. They closed off Boston and tried to get the British out of the city. And John Hancock, he was more an eager person he advised Joseph Warren to get in and get them out there, get them out of the town. But I think Joseph Warren was more careful, and he understood that probably we don't have the resources or the military power to do that at this point. So maybe a siege is a better way to sort of starve them out. And he was very involved in that, in the politics during those days, and dealt with the political. I think there were negotiations, for example, about exchange of not prisoners, but there were obviously Patriots being locked inside Boston, and vice versa. There were Loyalists who were locked out of the city. And there were negotiations in which Joseph Warren took a part, trying to arrange for families to be reunited on either side of the lines. I don't think those negotiations really resulted in a lot of happy reunification, but families continued to be split on the both sides of the city limit.
Right. And of course, as you already described, he was killed at the Battle of Bunker Hill. And will you remind me, how old was he at the time he died?
I think he was 34.
It's amazing how influential somebody who died that young could be across generations. And it's the political inspiration, but he also ends up being pretty influential in medicine. And that's due really to his choice of apprentices. You mentioned William Eustace briefly, but will you talk a little bit about the men who apprenticed as physicians with Dr. Joseph Warren?
Right. So I think he had a total of 5 apprentices during his relatively short career, 10 years, as you indicated earlier. Mm-hmm. And the common denominator between those were they were all from Harvard. So they had the similar background. So they were presumably well-educated young men. And there were 3 in particular that were interesting from an American Revolution standpoint. And that is Eustace, who later on got into politics and became, I think he was an ambassador in Holland for some time. And then he came back and became the governor of Massachusetts. Another apprentice was Samuel Adams Jr., so Samuel Adams' son, which is an interesting connection, obviously. And then, most importantly, his younger brother, John Warren, who apprenticed with Joseph. So Joseph was John's, I think, hero in life, and which made the tragedy at Bunker Hill even greater.
So what was the age difference between John Warren and his brother Joseph?
It was 12 years in between, if I remember correctly. Yes, 12 years. So he was, but he also went very similar type of education, Roxbury Latin School and then Harvard at the age of 14. And then he had an apprenticeship with his older brother.
And one thing I guess that would have been different for John, when I think about Joseph witnessing his father's death, he was, I think, 13 or 14 years old when his father died. But John would have been, I wonder if John would have even remembered his father.
So, right. So I think he was 2 or 3 years old. And I bravely argue in the book that he would remember that event the rest of his life. But John was actually there when it happened.
That's traumatic in a young child's life.
Right.
I guess because their father died when John was so young, Mary Warren, their mother, played a really big role especially in John's life. I loved your description of Thanksgiving at the Warren home. And as we're recording this, we're just a couple of weeks out from Thanksgiving here in the U.S. Will you give our listeners just a brief introduction to Mary and what her holiday celebrations were like?
So she was very keen on traditions, and every year she had her sons with her family come for the traditional Thanksgiving dinner, and she always made certain that she had made food enough so she could send them back home with a package of food for another couple of days. And she was described as a loving mother, obviously. And I think there was a close relationship between the mother and their sons, maybe in particular Joseph, as long as he lived, and then John. And there are letters preserved from those times, and she always talked to them about my son, my boy, etc. And even when they were grown up enough to be surgeons-in-chief at the Cambridge Hospital and so forth. And so I think it was a very close relationship, obviously further fostered by the fact that she was a widow and relied on their help. And I think the same thing, they were loving sons. So Joseph, when he was at Harvard, I don't think he stayed around and did what a lot of the other students did during the free time over the weekends, etc., etc. I think he came home and helped his mother with the farm, with practical things at the farm, and he felt responsibility also because she had been very supportive economically. In particular, when Joseph started the apprenticeship with James Lloyd, he needed some. I think he got a good deal anyhow, but I think he was helped by the fact that she put up some money as well to support Joseph during that apprenticeship. So it portrays, at least when you read about it, like a warm, very religious, and very morally high standard. She was very strict, I think, in terms of keeping the moral standard up and the religion up. And I think it looks like it was a warm family with a loving mother.
I think I remember reading that she lived into her 90s and she was very, very active into her mid or late 80s at least.
Yes, I think that's the case.
Sounds like quite a lady.
Yeah.
So speaking of John Warren, the younger brother, up until his apprenticeship with his older brother, Joseph. John Warren's education seems to have run pretty parallel to Joseph's. They both went to Roxbury Latin, both went to Harvard, both had medical apprenticeships. But after he finished his apprenticeship with Joseph, it seems like John Warren really struggled to establish a practice that would support him. Why did he end up moving and choosing to try and establish a practice in Salem?
Because I think even if there were not that many doctors around in those days, it was still a saturated market in Boston. And I think both he and Joseph understood that. So I think Joseph helped him give advice. You should probably look at somewhere else. And there was another surgeon who had just recently died up in Salem and left the practice after himself. So now it was only one Dr. Holyoke was up there. And so I think they both felt this may be a good opportunity. Even so, I think you pointed out that he struggled initially in terms of getting his foothold established in Salem, because he came in as a young, inexperienced surgeon or physician, and the people living in Salem, my understanding was that there was only one doctor in the world, and that was Dr. Holyoke. He had been there for a long time, and all of the previous doctor had died. There was still Holyoke there. And so I think John experienced that difficulty to breaking in, so to speak. And then after only about a year or so, the war started, and that obviously abruptly finished his career up in Salem. But I think he had started to gain some ground when this happened, and he was advised also by friends and colleagues. So when the Bunker Hill battle had happened, he said, well, enough of this medicine. I'm going to help out in the war, because there's a war coming, that's obviously. So he sort of thought about exchanging his scalpel to a gun, but he was advised by people up in Salem, I think, but also by his colleagues and friends, that you should serve. Yes, it's a good thing you want to serve the cause, but you should do it as a surgeon in the army instead.
Obviously, he wasn't publicly a politician the way Joseph was, but is there evidence that he had strong political leanings or Whig beliefs before the war broke out?
Yes, I think he was influenced by his brother. He spent a couple of years as an apprentice, and an apprentice in those days lived in the house of the master, and obviously this was really family. They were brothers, so yes, I think he could not have avoided to be influenced by Joseph's political activities and so forth.
How old would John have been, or how long after his apprenticeship, when Joseph died and John joined up as a continental surgeon?
Probably 22, 23, so he was a young man. And he was obviously that young when he moved and tried to establish himself as a surgeon in Salem as well, which may explain some of the difficulties he initially experienced.
Right. What would John's first posting or first assignment have been like as a continental?
He became a regimental surgeon. In those days, they were tested. At this time, I think John Morgan was the Surgeon General for the Army. Mm-hmm. Benjamin Church's short career had already been ended. And so John went through those examinations and was approved. And first he became a surgeon in one of the units. But then he also got involved with the, with Dorchester, with the Rochester Heights, and with the events in March of 1776, when the British had to evacuate Boston.
Well, it's interesting. I've read some of Dr. John Warren's letters to George Washington. He was one of the very first people who were admitted into Boston after the British evacuated. He was called to examine medical supplies that were left behind. Mm-hmm. And he describes these medicines that were laced with arsenic. But I've never been really clear whether it was a deliberate attempt to poison people or just some sort of accidental contamination in the chaos of trying to evacuate this town. What do you think happened there?
So I think there was deliberate. I think, the redcoats, the British forces were really upset that they had to leave Boston, and they had to leave without being allowed to plunder the city, because that was forbidden, and there was no time for it. So I think they just wanted to make it as difficult as possible for the Patriots when they came in to take it over. That's what I think. I don't recall any evidence for that, but you're right in pointing out that he was one of the first rebellions who were allowed in by George Washington. And the reason for that was that he was inoculated against smallpox. There was the fear for smallpox. So Washington was scared to death for the smallpox epidemic. And he understood, obviously, that if that were to spread among his soldiers, the cause would probably be lost, because the number of protected soldiers initially was very low, as opposed to the British, because the smallpox epidemics had been more prevalent in Europe, and inoculations had already been accepted there as more than on the American continent. So he said anybody who can prove that he had been inoculated or that he had had smallpox can go in. And there were, I think, about 1,000 soldiers and surgeons who went into the town after the British left.
Washington eventually would order the whole Continental Army to get inoculated, but that early in the war, it was still very controversial. It was way less universal at the beginning of the war.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was forbidden. Congress had forbidden it, and Washington forbade it because it wasn't without danger, as you know, because basically what the inoculation meant was that you gave the soldiers smallpox, and they would be bedridden, being sick for a while, not as seriously as after a natural contagion, but still. And so they were afraid. It was very controversial, as you said, the whole inoculation story still, even less than 1721. So you're right. So initially there was not only decided, but it was forbidden, but then he made a 180 degrees turnaround when he realized that this doesn't prevent the smallpox completely, so we better inoculate the army. And then, of course, he ordered everybody, all unprotected soldiers, to be inoculated.
After the British evacuation of Boston, John Warren's going to serve through the New York and New Jersey campaign that sees the American army get pushed slowly out of New York, through New Jersey, onto sort of the doorstep of the Patriot capital at Philadelphia. What was the role of Dr. Warren during that campaign?
After the evacuation of Boston, at that time, George Washington thought that the British would sail down to New York. So that's why he marched his troops down to New York. So he was astounded by the fact when he found out that actually they had sailed up to Halifax. But anyhow, he had all the troops down there. And then later on, a couple of months later, after I think sometime in May, John Warren, together with some other surgeons, got on their horses and were riding down to New York to help Washington with the war casualties because they were convinced it would happen. So he ended up being the chief, or at least a prominent surgeon at the General Hospital in Long Island, and saw the disastrous results of that battle, with thousands of Americans being killed. And at that time, John Morgan was also still the general surgeon general of the Continental Army. And so there were a lot of interactions between John Morgan and John Warren at that time. And then he followed the army on the retreat across Hudson River and Manhattan and over to New Jersey, and traveled down and retreated down New Jersey together with the forces. And he was actually also at the Trenton later on and at the Princeton battles. But then it's sort of the relationship between George Washington and John Warren at that time got sour.
So is that how he ended up coming back to Boston in the spring or summer of 1777?
Yes, I think that's why. Because at that time, there was a new Surgeon General, so there was a lot of fights between and a lot of jealousy and rivalry between the different surgeons, unfortunately.
The different surgeons being, you had regimental surgeons, you had hospital surgeons.
Yes. So that was one type of friction, but there was also friction and jealousy between the individuals within the same camp, so to speak. I mean, the prime example, obviously, between Morgan and Shippen. So at that time, after the Trenton and Princeton battles, Shippen had been appointed by Congress and by George Washington to be the new Surgeon General. And all of a sudden, John Warren felt left out because John Warren had been appointed at the time when John Morgan was in charge. So, and now Shippen was charged with getting his own people in. So he felt a little sidestepped. He felt sidestepped, and he wrote to George Washington and said, "Hey, I feel like I'm out of luck here, and I don't feel I have a role any longer. So I'm applying to you more formally for the promotion I think I deserve." And George Washington was pretty dismissive, I think, at least when you read the letters back and forth. It sounded basically that he said, "Well, tough luck, you're out of it." And then John Warren obviously got tired of that situation and said, I'll go back to Boston then, which I think was a good thing for medicine and surgery at least.
Yeah.
And for his personal life.
Well, speaking of his personal life, you write that he was young, good-looking, and a successful surgeon, which I read as John Warren was a catch. So right. His romantic life took off pretty soon after that. Can you describe who won his heart? So
that was Abigail, who was the daughter of the governor of Rhode Island. And she in herself was probably a catch. I mean, she was described both by John Warren and later on by John's and Abigail's son, Edward, as being very good looking and had was very popular. She probably was even popular among the higher up officers at that time. She ended up, when the British had been threatful in Rhode Island, she ended up in Cambridge initially, just at the time when George Washington came there, and she was entertained, or she moving around in the circles of George Washington, etc., etc. And there are some indications, at least described by some historians, that he had a good eye to her as well. Later on in the war, when the forces were more centered in Philadelphia, she was down there as well, and probably made success. And so she was probably a catch as well. But he was, John was lucky enough to catch her. And they got married and had, I think, a happy marriage.
As they're getting started in their marriage, John's trying to support the family on a fairly limited salary, it sounds like, of a general hospital surgeon. As he was still in a military role as a hospital surgeon, how was he also trying to build a private practice and grow some income?
Well, so just like his brother, I think he was a successful surgeon and he became popular in Boston. And he, in terms of income, he also wanted to take advantage of the appointments at the almshouse. And I think that's when he received some criticism that he was sort of pushing that maybe a little too hard. And so some of the politicians in Massachusetts at that time felt he was greedy and so forth. But he developed a successful surgical practice and actually did a couple of groundbreaking surgeries, groundbreaking for those days, and also became interested in the training, more formal training of surgeons, in addition to all the other intellectual and philosophical and humanistic interests that he had time to develop.
So speaking of sort of these groundbreaking or landmark surgeries that Dr. John Warren would have performed, there was one that was described in a lot of detail in the book as one of the first successful laparotomies.
Correct.
So can you describe for the listening audience what a laparotomy is and what he accomplished by performing that surgery?
So laparotomy means opening of the abdominal cavity. And again, we have to remember this was done without general anesthesia. So the patients were awake. So that was in itself a groundbreaking thing. And this, right. And this was probably the second, at least documented, laparotomy performed on the American continent.
And who was the patient in this case?
And the name of the patient is not given, but it's described as a young Negro woman. And she had noticed a mass in her abdomen since quite some time, probably several months. And so laparotomies, as I said, were obviously painful and dangerous. And John Warren's laparotomy happened 1759. No, the 759 is the first one I refer to, and that was John Bard. Right. Followed a couple of years later by John Warren's laparotomy on this young woman. And so it's described in detail in Edward's biography about his father. So I guess he had told him about what happened. So it's described how he makes the incision in the abdominal wall, and they enter the abdominal cavity and put their fingers in, obviously without operating gloves and without sterile conditions. And they found this big mass in the left, replacing the left ovary. And they took that out. Before they did that, they sort of entered that. It was a cystic lesion, sort of a sac type of lesion. And they found interesting material inside that cyst.
They described it as being stuffed with hair.
Right. So it was probably what we call a teratoma nowadays. So a teratoma is a type of tumor that develops from pluripotent cells, like stem cells, you would probably call them today.
Okay.
And they can develop into different types of tissues. So sometimes you can find hair, you can find sebaceous glands and sebaceous material, like soapy material, and you can even find cartilage and bones and teeth, etc., etc. But they did find hair that he described pretty well. And they took that out, and somehow the patient survived. Of course, most patients, or many patients, did not survive their surgeries, but she survived, and she became sort of a quote-unquote celebrity in Boston, with all physicians interested to look at this, to see this patient, and so she had a lot of visits in her hospital room. And then when she was discharged home, she survived also a longer time. She seems to have thrived, and she's described by Edwards as being ultimately a corpulent, overweight lady who lived for several years. He doesn't describe exactly how old she became. So that was something that made John Warren obviously famous as well, and sort of spread the rumor about him as a magic type of surgeon. He also did some other interesting surgeries that were also groundbreaking. And I didn't relay that or refer to that in the book, but one of the other procedures was a disarticulation at the shoulder region. So there was a soldier who had sustained severe injuries to his arm. And in those days it was considered a no man's land to try to disarticulate up in the shoulder region. But Warren at that time understood that was the only way to save that patient. And he did. And he became famous for that as well. And that may have been the first such procedure in the world.
Describe, if you don't mind, what does it mean to disarticulate a shoulder?
So that means to amputate the whole arm from the shoulder joint and down.
Rather than sort of at the elbow, that would have been more common? Well,
at the elbow, or just transecting the bones in the middle of the upper arm or middle of the arm. So it was more an anatomic type of procedure in that sense. But it was considered dangerous because you have a lot of nerve structures and the blood vessels and so forth in the armpit, up in the axilla or in the arm, that it could be dangerous, and was considered, as I said, almost you can't get to that area.
Would that have been during his wartime service then?
Yes.
That helps to highlight the reputation that John Warren had as an anatomist, that he was somebody who had studied the human anatomy in great detail. And I guess probably through that reputation and through his growing reputation in Boston, not that many years after his return to Boston, as the war was sort of winding down toward a negotiated peace, his alma mater came calling. How was the idea that ends up becoming Harvard Medical School born?
So I think it was an idea that John Warren had for some time and discussed with his friends and colleagues. And those discussions, I think, spread to the leaders of the Harvard College, Harvard University. And he obviously was aware of the fact that there were already two medical schools established in America at this time, one in Philadelphia and one in New York. And being in Boston, I guess he felt that we should have one up at Harvard as well. And then he got charged by the leadership at Harvard to develop a plan for opening a medical school. So that happened in 1782. So he then became the founder of sort of, basically one man was behind that. Obviously he didn't do it quite alone, but I think he was certainly the leader, the well-acknowledged leader of that effort. And then he became the first professor of surgery.
It sounds like at first when the school opened, there were basically 3 professorships or 3 areas of study within the school.
Right. So there was the surgery anatomy, It was a combined type of charge. And then you had the professor of physics, which was basically internal medicine. And then you had the chemistry aspect of it. And pharmacology as well, the pharmacy aspect of it. But I think the chemistry, the physics, and the surgery anatomy were the initial professorships.
And Warren was then the first professor of surgery, he said. There was an interesting little aside in the book as he was trying to recruit the rest of the initial faculty and deciding sort of how the internal workings of the school would go, as he was asking some of the folks at other medical schools around the country how seniority worked. Was it who had been in practice longer or who? And they said, no, it's just who got hired first. That worked well for him because he was the first one hired.
That's right. No, so he consulted in particular with his colleagues in Philadelphia, how they had arranged that, because the seniority question was important. And as you said, is it a seniority in terms of, being best educated, or is it in seniority in terms of being longest in the position, et cetera, et cetera? And you are right. So the longevity or the time of appointment was an important factor.
Where would the medical school have been located when it first opened in Boston? Or was it in Boston at first, I guess I should ask?
Right. No, it was in Cambridge, and it was all over. I mean, they used apartments, they used small rooms they could find, both for the different types of specialty they were teaching. And obviously with today's eyes, pretty primitive, both in terms of size and scope and localities. And there was a fight between the faculty and location, because there was a strive to move things into Boston because it was expensive and uncomfortable for the faculty for the people who lived in Boston at that time, having to travel across the river and all to Cambridge, and in particular in wintertime, it wasn't very convenient. But ultimately they moved into Boston.
At the time the first students graduated from Harvard Medical, would their study have taken the place of an apprenticeship? Would they go on to an apprenticeship? Would there still be something akin to today's residency after Harvard Medical?
Yes. So they also did apprenticeships, but the education in the medical school obviously took over much of that. And the emphasis was great, for example, at least from a surgical standpoint, on the dissections and the learning of the anatomy. But then, obviously there was no residency, but they obviously needed the practical aspect of learning it, and in addition to the theoretical. So the dissection was one of those practical aspects.
The focus on learning anatomy through dissection is interesting, because by the time John Warren was a professor of anatomy, he could more or less openly advertise that he was going to be giving a lecture involving dissection, where just a few years before, when he was a student, basically anybody who wanted to do a dissection had to be a grave robber.
Yes, at least to some extent. And so that's a shady area in itself. I mean, it's the regulation of retrieving corpses and so forth. There were laws in Massachusetts that allowed dissection and retrieval of executed criminals, for example.
It was a specific sentence that one could be sentenced to dissection for dueling in particular, I think.
Yes. But it was badly needed, obviously, if you wanted to learn anatomy. But still, even if they kept within the framework of the law, it was still controversial in many places. For example, Shippen down in Philadelphia, when he started his anatomy school, he got harassed by people, and there were mobs demonstrating outside the house where they knew dissections were going on, and stones were thrown into the windows, etc., etc. In New York, so similar things. During Bard's time, when there was a riot in New York, the doctors' riot in New York, which was basically an opposition or a riot against dissections that took place. And that also had a racial aspect, because in New York, at least, the grave robberies mainly took place at the graveyards for outside the city limits, where the black people were buried. They were not allowed to be buried inside the city limits. And so there was a lot of controversy and a lot of violence going on against that.
I want to ask about John and Abigail Warren's home life a little bit, because they found themselves, I think I read that they had 10 children to care for.
Yes.
And that was Joseph's surviving children, but also their own. How did it break down? How many children did John and Abigail have themselves?
I think they had five surviving children. I don't remember. I think they also had some children who died in infancy, if I remember correctly. But yes, so when the family was established, they had 5 surviving own children. John was sort of a family father. He is described as being very keen on keeping the traditions in the family and also religious and attending church regularly, etc., etc. And so they actually had a house. They ultimately got a home down at the School Street, I think, a street off Washington Street.
What was that home like? It sounds like it was a pretty large house.
Right. So it's described as a pretty large house, and it was sort of, so even though for example, his wife, Abigail, did not like the concept of slavery, and I think John was also opposed to it, like many people were in those days.
Well, it's interesting. John Warren's parents enslaved a handful of people, and Joseph had at least one enslaved servant in his life. So I was really curious to read that John and Abigail were so early and ardent about abolition.
Right. So, I think it was Abigail, John's wife, who said, talked about slavery as this curious or something like that, this curious institution in the society. There were a lot of opposition to the thought of it. So both John and Abigail didn't like the idea of slavery. And I think some of the people I describe in the book, there was a girl coming home to cut his hair every now and then, and there were other tasks being performed. And I'm not even sure if they were enslaved or if they were paid as servants at that time.
I think that given the timing, it was probably right in the middle of Massachusetts' gradual emancipation. So they were probably in some form of indenture rather than actually enslaved during those few years.
And several of the other surgeons that I describe in the book were also against slavery. Benjamin Rush, for example, was obviously very opposed to slavery and was active in that movement. Speaking
of Benjamin Rush, that brings to mind the one surgery that Dr. John Warren performed that most people probably have the most awareness of would be the mastectomy performed for Nabby, the only daughter of John and Abigail Adams. But most people are aware of that through the HBO miniseries about John Adams. And in the miniseries, they portray it as though Benjamin Rush had performed the surgery.
I haven't seen that miniseries myself, but I probably should because it sounds interesting. But anyhow, if it's portrayed that way, it's probably inaccurate. No, I think it's pretty well documented that John Warren, together with his son and some other assistants, performed the surgery. However, Benjamin Rush played a role in it. When Nabby started to feel the lump in her right breast, she was living in upstate New York at that time, as you know, and with her family. And she felt this lump in the right breast for quite some time. And it's actually a very interesting description of a breast cancer. And she finally told her mother that. And then her parents, both John and Abigail, told her to come down to Boston to see a real doctor. And so she traveled down to Boston and consulted different doctors in Boston. But she also knew that her father, John Adams, who at this time was the ex-president, obviously, was a good friend of Benjamin Rush. And Benjamin Rush at that time was probably one of the most highly respected physicians and surgeons in the country. And so she wrote a letter to Benjamin Rush herself and described the symptoms, etc., and the signs and what she had felt. And she described the the tumor, how it sort of seemed to grow first and then it was shrinking, and it was reddened skin on top of the tumor, which may indicate that she had an inflammatory breast cancer, which is one of the most aggressive types of breast cancer. But anyhow, and then, so Benjamin Rush read the letter, and he replied with his own letter, relatively soon, but not directed to her. So he sent the letter to her father, because he was concerned, or at least so he's thinking, he was concerned that she would be scared and upset if she read what he wrote. And he wrote that you should let the knife fly immediately, because this sounds like cancer. And he wrote about his 50 years of experience with that disease. And said that, any other treatment would just be futile, would not be good for her. And so she then consented to the surgery. So it was a quite dramatic experience for John and Abigail Adams, her parents, and obviously for the patient herself, and probably for John Warren itself, in addition to that.
And if it was happening in 1811, that was well into John Warren's career. He wasn't a new surgeon by any means at that point. He was one of the most respected surgeons in the Commonwealth, the anatomist at Harvard Medical School. What would the experience of a major surgery like that have been like for the patient, the family, and the surgical team in 1811?
I think horrendous for all of them. So it's described in some historians' descriptions of it that Nebby obviously was a brave person. She understood what was awaiting her, and she was described as coming to the operating room, which, by the way, was the second-level bedroom upstairs, her parents' bedroom. And
the house is Quincy, the people can still go visit anytime.
That's right. And then she came in the room, composed and calm, seemingly calm, dressed in her Sunday clothes and with a hymn book, from which she was singing through the procedure. But still, obviously, must have been tremendously painful, because there was no general anesthesia. And
what were the instruments like that Dr. Warren was using for this surgery?
So basically 2 or 3 instruments, or 4 instruments if we count what he used at the end. So basically a type of fork with which he could lift the breast from the chest wall, and then a sharp razor type of knife that he chopped the breast off once he had lifted it off, and then some additional knives. And it's interesting to read the descriptions of it, because he also found enlarged lymph nodes in the armpit at the same time. And I think the understanding that this was a dangerous and a fatal type of disease, that was well understood. And I think the concept of that type of tumor cancer spreading to the lymph nodes was also well established, because when he discovered that, he went in there and raised into the armpit and took those lymph nodes out as well. And then, of course, the 4th instrument that I refer to is a spatulum. So once the breast was off the chest wall, there was not skin enough to close with stitches to close the defect. So how to stop the bleeding? Well, so they used these glowing, heated spatulas. So in the operating room, quote unquote, they also had a little oven upon which these spatulas were heated, and with a glowing spatulum, and they used them to cauterize the area to stop the bleeding. And that in itself must have been a tremendous experience. And I think it was even too much even for John and Abigail. So they were present during part of the procedure, but I think at that time they walked out of the room. They couldn't take it any longer, if the descriptions are to be believed. But so what was the experience like for the patient and for the parents and for the patient? And for the surgeons, I think horrendous.
Yeah, it sounds horrifying.
But she survived the procedure, and after a couple of months, she could travel back up to her family in upstate New York. But unfortunately, she developed a recurrent breast cancer. She started having headaches, and probably she had brain metastases. And she came back to her parents' home in a poor condition and died after only a couple of weeks. And John Adams was the one who took care of her ultimately, and took care of her daily, taking care of his hygiene, and when she needed to go to the bathroom, etc., and was feeding her. Abigail couldn't put up with it. She couldn't just stand it.
Right. That very famous surgery comes close to the end of Dr. John Warren's career. In the end, he died in 1815, just a few months before Harvard Medical reorganized and appointed his son, John Collins Warren, as the school's first dean. What were the circumstances of John Warren's death?
He died from a pneumonia, but he also, at his autopsy, so he was undergoing autopsy after his death, he was found to have severe arteriosclerosis of his heart vessels, a coronary artery disease. And he had suffered from angina or chest pain a long time. But I think the immediate cause of death was probably pneumonia. He was out, he didn't spare himself, not even at the end towards his life, and he did home visits to sick patients, even in bad weather, even towards the end. He stayed home. He didn't see any patients the last couple of weeks, I think, but up until very close to the end, he kept struggling and trying to see patients, and family didn't like that. They advised him to stop and take it, calm down a little, but that was his nature, I think.
Then the younger John Collins Warren would go on to preside over the first use of anesthesia with William T.G. Morton in 1846. How did the Warren family come to have such an incredible influence over the practice of medicine in Boston for almost a century?
Must be some good genes somewhere around. They were smart people. And, John Collins was also present at the mastectomy of Nabby.
Oh, I don't think I realized that.
Yes, no. He had come back from training in England at that time, and he had started to build his own practice, and he was one of the assistants at the time. And he admired his father much. He said, well, I think I'm a pretty good surgeon, but I will never reach the level of my father, he said about John, which I think is also remarkable. But then, obviously, he went on to have a pretty grandiose career himself with the ether anesthesia and all what he did for surgery in Boston.
There's a passage where you're describing John Warren, and you say that he was a devoted husband, a father and family man. He was religious, impatient, quick to lose his temper, ready to fight for his honor. And then on top of all that, he was a skillful, brave, and highly regarded surgeon. So it sounds like you also have a lot of admiration for John Warren. Yes.
I think John Warren was one of the most outstanding surgeons at the time, and an interesting individual with a lot of aspects and facets to his life. So I admire that a lot. And just to dare to do the type of operations he did, also writing, it's interesting to, I think the first paper published in New England, in the Future New England Journal of Medicine, was actually by John Warren. And it was about coronary artery disease, interesting enough, which he suffered himself.
Well, our listeners may not believe it, but that covers just the first 2 chapters of the book, Revolutionary Surgeons, Patriots and Loyalists on the Cutting Edge. If people want to follow you or your work online, or do you do Twitter or social media?
So I have a Facebook account and also a website, Per-Olof Hasselgren. It's my name, first and second name in one word, .com.
Well, Dr. Per-Olof Hasselgren, I just want to say thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
To learn more about Dr. Per-Olof Hasselgren and his book, Revolutionary Surgeons, Patriots and Loyalists on the Cutting Edge, check out this week's show notes at hubhistory.com/237. We'll have links to Dr. Hasselgren's website and Facebook profile, plus a link where you can support the show and your local bookstore by purchasing the book Revolutionary Surgeons. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email podcast@hubhistory.com. We're Hub History on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Or you can go to hubhistory.com and click on the Contact Us link. While you're on the site, hit the subscribe link and be sure that you never miss an episode. If you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, please consider writing us a brief review. If you do, drop us a line, and we'll send you a Hub History sticker as a token of appreciation. That's all for now. Stay safe out there, listeners.